All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending this session. So today I'm going to talk about progressive state management with Angular. So before I get started, just a few words about myself. My name is Alain, or just Al. I'm a GDE in web technologies, Angular, and Google Maps. And I've been working with Angular.js since 2011. So that was a very long time ago that I got started with Angular.js. And these days, I'm basically helping companies work with Angular. So I do a lot of consulting, technical training around Angular and JavaScript. And my website is NgRx.com. I'm based in Sacramento, California, where I'm also the organizer of the Angular meetup group, as well as the Google developer group Sacramento. So that's me. Now, usually when we do these events in person, I like to start with a quick poll and ask a few questions about the topic that I'm about to cover. So we can do that in the chat today if you want to answer those quick questions by saying, hey, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. So the first question is, who is using NgRx or NgXS or Akita or any state management library with Angular? So that's question number one. Question number two is, who is considering using state management but not really doing it yet? And the third question is, who thinks that state management is too complex, scary, too verbose, and maybe something we're going to do later? So I can give you a few seconds to answer those different questions. So when I poll people about these different topics, usually I would say 10% of the audience is using a state management library, so NgRx, NgXS, Akita, or something else. Maybe 1/3 of the audience would be saying, we're considering doing it, but we're not sure how to go with it. We're not sure, we don't have the time to do so, we don't know which option to go with, and all of that. And the rest of the world thinks, well, we heard about it, but kind of scary, so we want to learn more about that and then maybe decide what to do with it. So that's the goal of this talk today. My goal is really to give you an idea of what are your different options, how you can do state management with Angular, and how to take what I would call a progressive approach to getting into state management. So what do I mean by that? What is progressive state management? So of course, when you write your Angular applications, you have tons of options on how to manage your data, how to manage the state of your application. When you just get started, usually what we would do is create components, and we would put all of the data that we'd render in our components, and most of the logic would be in there. That works, that's easy to implement, it's great when you start with the framework, but if you have a little bit more experience with Angular, you probably learned that this is a bad idea to have the data live where the rendering happens. A component is supposed to be all about rendering information, not being aware of where the data comes from and managing that data. So usually we would rely on a service to do that. So that's option number two, defer data management to a service. And the service is going to have that data, and then our component is going to access the service through data bindings. So getters, setters to set some info, get some info, and render it on the screen. That's a better option. Still pretty easy to do, not quite perfect yet. Then you probably heard about Rx.js and observables and subjects and all of that. And a third option is going to be to use an observable store service. So really getting into using Rx.js to manage our state and have a pattern around how we're going to use Rx.js to manage our state. So this is getting good, really, in terms of architecture. This is going to help you have a clear separation of concerns between what you render on the screen and where that data comes from. But of course, from a code perspective, it's going to be a little bit more complex. And finally, you have the ultimate option, which is to go with a state management library. So that would be getting NgRx, NgXS, any of that, any of these options, and then go all the way and manage your state that way. So this is of course more complex. This is of course going to require more experience with state management, with Angular, and with React.js. So the good news is you can do it any way you want, right? And my goal today is to show you examples of all of these different options. And I'm going to evolve the service from a super basic one with just getters and setters into using React.js, then using an observable store, and then using a state management library. So you can see that code evolve step by step, progressively from no state management, meaning just using getters and setters to get set data, to using a state management library to do so. So let's get started. So we're gonna demonstrate all of these options one by one. The thing is, there is no silver bullet solution in any of this. It's really up to you in the end. It all depends on the project size and the complexity that you have in your project. Some projects are perfect candidates to have state management everywhere. Others, absolutely not. It really depends on your needs. What I'm doing here is not suggesting to go all the way to using a state management library all the time. Quite the opposite. I want to show you that it is possible to start nice and easy, get comfortable with a solution, and then if you think that you need more over time, progressively get into using React.js, then using a store, then maybe using a state management library. So it's going to be a more progressive approach that way, which is of course easier to adapt because you don't have to learn all of it at once. You can start and then little by little increase the amount of code and state management features that you have in your application as it grows. So the first option I want to talk about, this one I'm pretty sure everyone is familiar with. That's using services and data bindings. So if we take a look at some code, the application I'm going to work with for all of these examples is a license plate store. So it's a store displaying a bunch of products, and these products they have prices, and up here I can change the currency that we use to render these products. So by default it's USD. I can switch to euros, and as soon as I click to euro, you can see that the prices got updated with an exchange rate applied to them, and the currency symbol got updated as well. And we also support British pounds, so that's a third currency. Again, as I clicked, you can see that the amount changed and the currency symbol changed. So that's a pretty basic feature. We want to be able to select one of these options and have all of our components on the screen react to that update and re-render all of those prices based on the current currency information. So in order to do so, I'm going to start with a service. So currency service is the place where we're going to keep track of both the current currency. So here, by default, it is set to USD, and the exchange rates. So that's an object with all of the different exchange rates that we have available. And once we have that service in place, in order to switch between the different currencies and get the corresponding exchange rate, it's a bunch of getters and setters. So I can set a new currency, I can get the current currency, and I can get the exchange rate that goes with the current currency. So super easy to read. It's really a basic class with getters and setters. So that's really the main plus for that option. Easy to read, easy to understand. The business logic is all here, and it's 27, 26 lines of code, so pretty compact. Now, of course, in order to use that code, we are going to have to inject that service in the different components that's needed. So in my case, there is a currency switcher, which looks like this. So that service gets injected in here. And then when I click on that dropdown to change the currency, I'm calling the setter to make it happen. And in the template of that component, we have a getter that is going to read the value from the currency service. And that way, as you saw, as we click and select a new currency, the change is happening. All of the components react instantly and display the current value. That's because of these bindings. So the key feature of Angular that makes this work is all of these data bindings. Because we have data bindings, whenever the state of the currency service gets updated, these methods are going to be invoked again to get the latest value of getCurrency. So that's a good thing. It works pretty nicely, but from a performance perspective, this getter is going to be invoked many times. So if it was doing something a little bit complex, if it was doing some sort of, I don't know, calculation or anything like this, that could become a problem. That could become pretty slow, and you could see an impact on performance. But for a very basic use case, using a service like this is a very good option. So if we want to optimize things and start thinking about performance, about having better change detection around our implementation and all of that, then we would still use a service, but instead of using those getters, setters, we would switch to using an observable. So what does that look like? Let's go back to some code. So same example, same feature where I want to be able to change the currency and get all of my components to react to that update. So I rewrote that service. And the key now in that service is that instead of managing the states through a single variable for my currency, I'm using a subject from NgRx.js. So that subject is a specific type of observable that I can use to emit some information to multiple different subscribers. That way, when I change the currency, what's going to happen, so I still have that setter to set a new currency, but instead of setting a value and then relying on bindings to get the updates, I'm going to emit the new value through that subject. So instead of being binding-based, I would say, now this is event-based, because whenever I get a new currency, whenever a new currency is set, I'm going to emit an event. I'm going to emit an update for the currency information. And in that update, I'm sending the new currency that was updated, as well as the exchange rate that goes with it. As a result, in order to get that value, we have to subscribe to it, right? We're emitting an event through NgRx.js using observables. So we have to subscribe to that observable in order to receive the data. So my getter here is not really a getter anymore. It's a method that returns an observable of currency information. And from a code perspective, that is it. So see that I have pretty much the same amount of code, 28 to 29 lines of code. And I added some extra types. So I created an interface, currency info, to wrap these two pieces of information together, the currency and the exchange rate. And I also created a default info, which is default currency USD, default exchange rate 1. So that's really the code that I added. Everything else remained pretty much the same, and we introduced a behavior subject in here. So this is better from a performance perspective because now the click on that dropdown is basically pushing updates to all of the components that need it. We're not relying on these bindings being interpreted over and over again to check, hey, is there something new? Hey, is there something new? Is the state different than before? Now this is happening through subscriptions. So we're pushing the updates and all of the subscribers receive it and render that info. So of course this means that I have to subscribe to that observable. So now in the currency service, we get the observable, and I'm using an operator, map, because in the case of that specific component, I only need the currency, not the exchange rate. So using the map operator, I'm extracting that single info to turn it into an observable of just the currency. And then in the template, in order to render the currency that is currently selected, I'm subscribing to that observable using the async pipe, which, as you're probably aware of, is the easiest way to subscribe to an observable because it's going to take care of subscribing to it, getting the data, and automatically unsubscribing when this component gets destroyed. So this is a more reactive approach using Nux.js, using observables, and not relying on bindings anymore. So instead of having a getter-setter based approach, now we have a subscription based approach. That's option number 2. Option number 3 is to use that idea. So now we have a service that is using Nux.js, and it is managing my currency and all of that. Chances are that in my project, I'm going to have several different pieces of information like this that are going to use that same pattern, right? That are going to use a subject to emit the information to different subscribers. So if we're using the same pattern over and over again, then it probably makes sense to refactor it into an approach that would do it once for all. And this is what is usually known as an observable store service, where we create a class, a common abstract class, that is going to wrap that subject of the information that we want to store, and then have all of the features to set a new value and subscribe to the new values being added to that store. So it's really just taking that same approach, but pushing it one step further. Again, the idea is to go progressively and adding little by little some refactoring, some improvements to make our state management work better. So let's take a look at this example now. So the store class looks like this. So I created a store of type T, so using NgRx in TypeScript, because this store could contain any sort of object. In my case, it's going to be currency information, but in real life, you could reuse that store for any piece of info in your app, the user session, profile info, any sort of data could be stored in an instance of that store. So the state is really that behavior subject. So we use a behavior subject because a behavior subject has a default value, and usually, not always, but usually when we want to store some info, we want to at least have something to provide the user by default. We want to have something to render by default in our app. So this store is taking an initial state as a parameter in its constructor, and as soon as we have that initial state, we initialize our behavior subject with the value. And from there, we have a getter to return that state. So this gives us an observable of that, the type of that data. And the setter is really going to use the state and emit the next value, right? So same idea, same approach as before, but now refactored with generic types. So we can reuse it over and over again in different services to manage all of the different pieces of information that we have in our application. So this, of course, changes my currency service, because now my currency service extends that new store class that I created. And I know the type of the data. It's going to be a store of currency info. The default value, I pass it to the constructor like so, passing my default info to the super constructor of the super class. And when we call the setCurrency setter, we use setState to update the value, to which we pass our currency and the exchange rate that goes with it. So same amount of code, pretty much, still less than 30 lines of code, but now the approach is refactored, so I could use it for multiple different services, and that would apply to, again, any piece of info that I have in this application. From a component perspective, from a subscriber perspective, things stay the same. It was using observables before, we are still using observables here. So we still inject that service, get the observable. So it used to be get currency info, now it's get state, because it's a more generic approach. So we get the state of that currency service, which is the observable of the information we need. And we do the mapping through the pipe method to extract the currency out of it. And then, of course, our template still subscribes to that observable. So that's option number 3. And now, as you can tell, we are pretty much closer to using a state management library, because if you've learned about state management libraries before, you're probably aware that they have this notion of store. And my class here is getting closer to really almost looks like a state management, super tiny library, but getting closer to that. So this leads us to the ultimate option, and that's using a state management library to to do all things from that approach. So before I show you the code, my code is going to be using NgRx. So I took an Angular state management library that I like. There are other options available. Most of them are really using the same pattern, meaning no matter the library that you use, you get pretty much the same features and the same ways to manage your state. In case you're not familiar with state management libraries, I'm going to do a very short intro, a very short summary about how it works. And in order to explain that, I'm going to use an example that everyone is aware of, that everyone knows about. Now I know this picture is not very 2020. We see people close together, no mask and any of that. I should have edited it. But anyways, let's assume it's a normal year. We can go to a coffee shop and order coffee, and we don't need to wear any mask. So when you go to a coffee shop, you're going to order some coffee or something else. So from a state management perspective, this means we dispatch an action. We say, hey, I want to order some coffee. And the state management system is going to change state. And it's going to say, well, okay, we're going to do that, but first we're waiting for your payment. So then we're going to pay for our order. That's the next action that we dispatch to use the state management terms. We're going to pay for that order, which is going to turn our coffee shop to say, okay, the order is now created. And once that order is created, a side effect is going to start. That side effect is going to be the barista, the guy on the left here, working on that order. So it's going to take probably a few minutes for the coffee to be ready. And once that order is finally ready, then the coffee shop is going to dispatch another action, which is order ready, at which point I can pick up my coffee and enjoy it. This is state management in a nutshell. When we work with a state management library, all of the interactions with our state management library are going to happen through actions and state updates. So in the case of our good old license plate store, so I created a state class with NgRx. It is called currency state. And what makes it a state object is the following decorator at the top. So I'm specifying that it's a state of currency information. The name for that state is currency info. The default value is currency of USD exchange rate of 1. And in order to change the value for that state, we're going to need an action. So in the case of that example, there's only one action. It's changing the currency. That's the only thing we can do with our state. We can dispatch an action to update the currency. So we create a basic class here known as change currency, which is the type of that action. We provide a description for it, which is explicit enough. So just by looking at it, we know, oh, okay, this is a way to change the currency used by the application. And in that constructor, we have a payload, which is really the information that we want to change in our state. So we have an action. We have the state. Now we have to provide a way to handle the state. So this is usually called a reducer function. And the reducer function is going to take your action, apply it to the current state, and return a brand new state with the update required by that action. So this is my reducer function down here. It is one because I added the @action decorator on top of it. And that @action is linked to the change currency class. So whenever that action is dispatched in our system, this reducer is going to come into play, take the action, get the state of the application, and update the state with the new values. So changing the currency with the one we got from our action and changing the exchange rate as well. This is all based on observables as well. All of these Angular state management libraries, they support observables. So in my component, when I'm going to update the currency, this is going to be this code. So instead of injecting a specific service, in that case, we inject a store. So the store is a global state manager for your entire application that knows about every single state there is to know about. So it is a global object, we inject it in here, and when I want to change my currency, I'm going to dispatch an action. So I dispatch a change currency action, passing that currency as a parameter. And that's it. From there, all of the work that has to happen for that currency to change is going to be taken care of by the state management library. So dispatch is the equivalent of my set state earlier, or set currency even earlier. This is going to have the benefits of automatically notifying any component, any subscriber that needs that info. So with NgRx, there's this notion of selector. So there's a select decorator that I used here to tell the library that I'm interested, I want to subscribe to any updates to the currency information, more specifically the currency in that case. So I'm selecting that part of the state. This returns an observable that I can subscribe to. And the way we subscribe to it, again, it's an observable. So we're going to use the async pipe to do so. So now I'm using a state management library. Of course, for this basic example, it can seem like an overkill. It seems like it's probably a little bit too much for such a simple example. But the idea was to show you that really we can go progressively, and we can build piece by piece, add some reactivity to our state management, and then refactor it into an observable store, and then maybe say, okay, now we're close enough to using a state management libraries. Let's do it and switch to doing exactly that and use a state management library. So that's all I wanted to show you today. Thanks a lot for your attention. I hope this was helpful. We're gonna answer some questions in the Q&A, so feel free to chat with me if you have any questions. And again, thanks a lot for watching this talk.